Hello and welcome back to the Ask Podcast. I'm Ashley Hendricks, and today I was going through Matthew 17, 14 through 20. And so these specific verses are a continuation of what we did last time in Matthew 17, 1 through 13. And this is the next section of that movement. And so I'm going to turn over to those verses real quick, and then we can just jump right into it. All right, so I just turned to Matthew 17 in my Bible and in my written out Bible. And so before we even start, I'm going to read through the passage with you. So this is what the passage says. It's a quick 6 verses, but it packs a good punch. So it says, starting in verse 14, "And when they had came to the crowd, a man came up to him, and kneeling before him said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures, and he suffers terribly. For he often falls into the fire, and often under the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him.' And Jesus answered, 'O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me.' And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' He said to them, 'Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" So that's really amazing. And so jumping into that, starting reversing back to the first verse 14 through 15 is the first bit that I did some notes on. And I called this section in my little commentary in my notebook, "Son with seizure goes to Jesus." It's just a little overarching, what does that mean? And these were the verses, 14 and 15. "And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him, kneeling before Jesus, and said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures, and he suffers terribly.'" So this guy comes up to Jesus, kneeling before him, bringing himself physically lower than Jesus, saying, "I know you are Lord, help me." He says, my son, he's talking about his son, he falls into the fire and often into the water. So this demon, whatever's happening and attacking his son, is causing harm to his son. So he goes to Jesus, "Please, Lord, heal him." The first thing that I wrote about it was that the man knelt down, showing us that he knew Jesus' authority. Before he even went to Jesus, he knew what Jesus could do, especially as we read a little bit later in comparison to the disciples. This man knew that Jesus wasn't like his disciples. He knew that when the disciples couldn't do something, Jesus must be able to, because he's not the same as the disciples. He's not just another teacher. And then it talks about how his son fell into the fire and into the water, these things that were harming him. I said he falls into the fire and water because of something he can't control. And below that I said this could be an image of humanity and our sin nature. You see, though our spirit does not desire to get burned or to drown, our sinful flesh draws us into it. And so it's this idea of the demonic possession leading us towards, or the sin nature in our case, leading us towards brokenness, leading us towards death. I feel like a lot of brokenness and death and demonic possession can always be tied back to an image of ourself and an image of our own sin nature in that sense. And so that's what I kind of got from that beginning part, a father going to Jesus, kneeling before him, saying, "My son is suffering from this demon that he cannot control." But then the next couple verses go on and talk about how this man, this father, had already tried going to the disciples, and they couldn't do anything. Verse 16 says, "And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him." And so this man had already gone to try to go to the followers of Jesus, those who represented him, who should have been able to do that, should have been able to heal his son, but they couldn't. And he's telling Jesus that. And so I isolated that verse on its own, and I wrote down the heading being, "Disciples could not heal him." And then this is what I wrote below it. "The Father had an expectation for the followers of Christ to fulfill, but they never did. That does not mean that God isn't and or wasn't faithful." You see, this man understood the disciples were not a perfect representation of what Christ could do. And so then he went straight to Christ when the disciples failed. A lot of people, this reminds me of something like church hurt. A lot of people leave the church because the people of the church didn't represent Christ well. But this man showed faith. Instead of leaving Christ and just saying, "Oh, this is a bunch of rubbish," when the disciples couldn't heal his son, he decided, okay, instead, I'm going to actually go to the source. When man failed, he didn't just assume that it was God failing. He understood that man was was flawed and could not fulfill these things as easily and as simply as Christ could. So then he went to Christ. And so it doesn't mean that God wasn't faithful, but it meant that humans carry the imperfect image of Christ, the imperfect image of the fullness of Christ. We should be an outlet for unbelievers and for other believers who are struggling to go to, because we are representations, but we are also imperfect representations of the fullness of Christ. And so that's what I kind of wanted to take away from that verse specifically. You see, this father with his son having seizures understood that humanity wasn't perfect and that they weren't going to be a perfect representation of Christ. When man couldn't fulfill what God should have allowed him to, he went straight to the source, and that's what we ought to do. When our fellow believers fail us, we should go straight to the source and not just assume that Christ is perfectly represented by an imperfect man. And then the next verse is Jesus' response to this man. In verse 17, it says, "And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me." And so this section I isolated and I called it this: Jesus' address to the faithless, twisted generation. This was Jesus' address to these faithless and this twisted generation. But why were they faithless? Why were they twisted? But this is what I wrote down about it. I said that Jesus understood that the disciples, by a reason that I don't particularly know, maybe it was a pride in achieving their own purposes or something like that, or in their own power, by some reason the disciples did not function according to the strength of the Father through Jesus. Jesus saw this. He was like, I can see that for some reason you guys, he knew what the reason was, whether it was pride or something, that they could not fulfill what God had called them to do. But then Jesus expected the disciples to be able to exhibit proper faith in God's work with all the signs and everything. He said, you faithless generation. Because he understood that for whatever reason that I don't know, the disciples didn't fulfill what they ought to have. Even though Jesus knew that they were imperfect, he also knew that he was able to work through them if they had, just as we're going to read later, the faith of a mustard seed. Jesus knew they were imperfect, but he didn't give them an excuse for that. He called them a faithless and twisted generation. And you see, Jesus was even alluding to something that was going to happen. He says, how long am I to bear with you? How long am I to be with you? And so Jesus was alluding to the time that he was leaving. He was leaving soon. And so they ought to be prepared to go out in faith without the physical manifestation of Christ. The disciples, Jesus is reminding them, how long am I going to be with you? If I'm here physically with you and you cannot be faithful, what's going to happen when I leave? Jesus is calling them to action, calling them to faithfulness, calling them to say, put away your flesh, put away your selfish pride, and follow me truly with a true faith. And then I said this, Jesus said, bring him here to me, showing the heart behind the rebuke. The heart behind the rebuke, the heart behind Jesus saying, oh, faithless and twisted generation, how long am I going to be here with you? You can't always expect me, the perfect one, to solve your problems. You have to let me work through you because I won't be here all the time. And then Jesus says after that, instead of, you should have been able to do it, I'm leaving, he says, bring him here to me. It shows the heart behind that rebuke. Jesus did not rebuke the generation because they were relying too much on him, but he rebuked possibly, I can't know for sure, possibly because he knew the pain that was to come and how they were showing signs of not being equipped for Jesus to leave. And then I said, he rebuked them because he loved them so. Jesus rebuked this generation because he understood that he wanted them to be prepared for his departure. He was going to go from being with them to being in them, and they had to have faith to allow him to work through them. And then we have the next verse, verse 18, of Jesus acting on it. When he said, okay, bring him here, this is Jesus acting on it in verse 18. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. So I isolated this part on its own, and this is what I said. Demonic oppression was not even a question for Jesus. This is a different view that I kind of noticed a part of this verse in verse 18, when it talked about Jesus rebuking the demon. Nobody up to this point had even talked about there being a demon involved. They just said that my son has seizures. He's falling into the fire, and he is falling into the water, and it's causing him a lot of pain. I went to the disciples to have him healed, and they couldn't do it. And Jesus said, you're twisted and broken. It's because of your faith, or your faithlessness. And then so immediately, when Jesus says, bring him here to me, it says, and he rebuked the demon. So often nowadays, we give credit to physical ailment just as being natural causes, but so little do we consider that it's demonic oppression or possession in some cases. This is the New Testament. This is when Jesus has come. The demons can still do these things, but we so often despiritualize life. So this is what I continued writing. The demonic oppression was not even a question for Jesus, but so often we don't recognize pain like that. You see, humans ought not to ignore the spiritual powers of darkness in this world. You see, I grew up in a Baptist home, and so it's not something that I naturally lean towards, is assuming that something was demonic oppression or something like that. But what I do have to say is that we must not ignore it. That is one of the biggest and vital powers of the enemy, is saying, I'm not even here. One of the biggest weapons that they use is making you think that they're not even there, so that we can't even speak the name of Jesus against them. But I've grown to realize the importance of recognizing the spiritual powers of darkness and how they can work against us. And then I said this, it did not take a while for the boy to be healed. He was not overtaken by the fallen flesh, but by determined darkness. You see, when I wrote that down, I had this different mindset of what was really overtaking this little boy. You see, this son, when Jesus healed him, immediately he was healed. It was fully the demonic oppression that was causing these things. It was not just a fallen flesh or some consequence for a sin that he had done. When he went to Jesus, he was healed instantly. Let me read that again. It did not take a while for the boy to be healed. He was not overtaken when he was broken, when he was having seizures and demonically oppressed. He was not overtaken by the fallen flesh, but it was a determined darkness that was against him. You see, Jesus loved him enough to instantly remove the demon. What a love. What a love. And then I continued on in verse 19, and this is what he says. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? The disciples recognized, Lord, why couldn't we cast out the demon? Why didn't we have that power? And then this is Jesus' response. You see, I isolated this verse. The disciples asking Jesus why they couldn't. Verse 19. You see, rather than staying quiet with assumptions, they asked why they couldn't heal the boy, though they did it privately. They at least were bold enough to ask. You see, the reason why I wrote that down is because that specific part of the verse stands out to somebody like me. Somebody who is shy, somebody who is very just I'm just going to try to learn things from observing and then just try to do better on my own. But rather than trying to do better on their own, the disciples asked Jesus, why couldn't we? They humbled themselves enough in that moment to ask and say, Jesus, why? Let me read that again, the verse in 19. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and asked, why could we not cast it out? This is the next thing I wrote. They could not recognize their own sin that held them from faith. So instead of shying away, they asked Jesus to reveal it to them. They understood that they couldn't recognize what was keeping them from faith, and so they asked Jesus. The power that was supposed to be in them wasn't present because of little faith we'll learn in the next verse. But they weren't afraid to ask Jesus. And so I want to encourage you all to not be afraid to ask Jesus, Lord, why can I not act in your will? And then we circle around to verse 20, Jesus' response. This is what verse 20 says. It's a bit of a longer verse. He said to them, because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of a mustard seed, you'll say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. You see, in that isolated verse, this is what I said. Jesus tells them of their little faith in verse 20. What I wrote down was this. It was the disciples' lack of faith that led them to inability. You see, Jesus compares the amount of faith needed to move mountains with that of a mustard seed. What does that even mean? I feel like this is one of the more popular verses, like faith of a mustard seed can move mountains. But what does that even mean? You see, though the mustard seed starts small, this is what I want you to know. When it says a mustard seed, it's one of these smallest seeds ever. You see, though it starts small, it grows into one of the greatest trees in the garden. You see, the mustard seed amount of faith, it is small, but it grows. It grows into one of the biggest trees in the entire garden. You see, Jesus was calling on the audience to understand the significance of quality over quantity when it comes to faith. You see, Jesus knows that our sin nature will only get us to a certain amount of confidence in faith. So he understands that he can't call us to say, have a perfect faith. We can't. It is not in our sinful ability to. But if we step out in that, if we step out in it, even for a moment, then we will have the ability to do anything. Because Jesus understands our heart. And you see, Jeremiah 17:9 says, though the heart is deceitful above all else. But Jesus understands the moments that we overcome the flesh and we deny the flesh and we submit to the Spirit, even if it is just for a mustard seed amount of faith. He understands that and he recognizes it. And with that, we have the ability to do anything. And then this is what I said next. The message of the impossible with such little faith is to emphasize God's work and ability, not ours. That despite man, he can do all things. Let me say that again, that despite man, God can do all things. He doesn't expect us and he doesn't want us to live out in perfect faith. Of course he wants us to, but he doesn't expect it. Because in our imperfect faith, he can say, I can work anyways. Even with an imperfect vessel, God can make something so beautiful. And that is such a testament to him and his character and his power. To be able to use someone like me with so little power and so much against him. What a joy it is that he can use me anyways. What a testament to how powerful God is. So long we give him an inch, he will run with it and he can do all with it. And so that was what I just read in Matthew 17 verses 14 through 20. Because those specific verses, this is like my main idea. Basically, if you're going to take anything away from these verses, understand that God does not expect perfect faith. He expects any faith. If you submit to him at all, you are going against your sin nature. If you submit to God at all, you are going against your sin nature. You are denying the flesh, you're taking up your cross, and you're choosing God. And with that little bit of faith, God can do far exceedingly more than we can ever do. And it's because of the little faith that we can testify so greatly in our hope in God. It is because of our little faith that we can have joy. So that's what I kind of wanted to share with you. And from the beginning of these passages, I want you to understand that even if man doesn't represent Christ well, whether it's in the church, whether it's in your family, whether it's in a community, just because man represents Christ poorly doesn't mean Christ is unfaithful or that God is changing. It just means that man is broken. And I don't want you to forget that. I want you to realize that God is so far exceedingly greater than a broken humanity. And so I wanted to thank you so much for listening in and tuning into another episode of the Ask Podcast. I am your host, Ashley Hendricks. And I've been writing the Bible out, and that's what this little book in between is, just me writing the Bible out, and I'm bringing you along as I make notes in this journal at the bottom over what each verse means and over what I'm studying and finding out, and I'm just sharing that with you all. And so I hope that you all have a fantastic fall day, and whether it's morning, evening, night, I hope you have just a fantabulous day. If you want to find the Ask Podcast anywhere else for additional episodes and more official products, then I want you to go over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you continue on YouTube, which is fantastic. Please subscribe, turn on your post notifications so that you don't miss a video. And then I want to encourage you to read your Bible today, even if it's just one verse. just as the quality is so much more important of your faith, I want your quality of the Bible reading to be more important than your thought on quantity, right? Even if you read just a verse, it's more important for you to read a verse and to actually understand it than to read a whole chapter and not get anything out of it. And so I want to encourage you to get in the Bible, to read it, to pray with the Lord before and after, and continue in prayer throughout your day. Have a fantabulous day. Love y'all. Bye.